Hi.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for coming on the podcast, John.
No problem.
So, astronomy. I am fascinated by astronomy, and I know a lot of people are. And it'd be great if we could just talk about some of the key points, particularly for people who are just getting into astronomy, the sort of equipment they need, the things they can look for in the UK skies. I'm particularly interested when I look out at the sky, it's a bit bewildering, it's a bit confusing at first when you look at the stars.
Yeah.
Um, and I know after doing some reading, there are things called star charts and particularly apps for your phone that you can use.
Yeah.
Where would you advise people to start from if they're interested in getting into stargazing?
Well, these days, very much what you just said, with apps now on your phone or tablet or whatever, or even on your computer, there are so many free ones. I mean, there's some paid ones, but there's some very good free ones that you can download. Things like Stellarium, etc. And they vary in complexity, but I would say. Something like Star Walk or something like that you can get for the iPad. If they're not free, they're usually only a couple of quid. And of course, that'll allow you to literally point your mobile phone up at the sky, and it'll show you on the screen what's there, as long as you're synced up for your position, etc. As most of us are automatically anyway with the phones. And that makes it very good. In the olden days, they would use star charts, and a lot of hardened astronomers will still use those, if you know what I mean. I suppose over the past few years, there's been a sort of 50-50. Real hard set astronomers would rather do it that way, and setting circles and all the things like that. But nowadays, telescopes are computerized. They hook up to the internet. As long as you align them properly, they'll zoom to whatever you want to look at, which makes it a lot more easy for everybody else, especially those getting into it. Because I suppose there's a lot of people would get into it and then get frustrated if they've got to do it the old-fashioned way, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely. Going back to telescopes as well, I know that a lot of frustration comes from buying telescopes and not knowing how to use them correctly.
Yes, that's true. There's about three different types of telescopes, really. The most difficult one for a beginner to use would be an equatorial telescope, which has to be set up really well to track the night sky. And a lot of people get frustrated. I think the most thing that people get frustrated with when buying a telescope is probably more the fact that you see the photographs on the box, which are basically photographs that have been taken by the Hubble telescope, and they're all the James Webb one now, and they're all super colored photographs. And in reality, our eyes don't see that at night. You're probably aware we don't really see color very well at night as humans. Say for example, you went out in your street at night, a red car would look a brownish color, generally speaking, in the dark. We haven't got the sensitivity. So looking through the eyepiece, a lot of the things that you can see, obviously not planets or whatever, but lots of galaxies, nebulas, things like that. These highly coloured nebulas look just grey, really. So people get it and go, oh, it's a bit of a grey blob there. I'm not that interested, thanks. And also, a lot of people will buy a telescope that is, sort of much too big for them. And to start, they'll think, oh, I ought to have the biggest equipment, go in straight off, jump in with a deep end, and then get fed up of it. And then there's, of course, you've got the British weather thrown into that mostly, and it'll spend most of its time in a shed or in your kitchen or whatever, and they lose interest, really. You can photograph through these telescopes with DSLR cameras or specific cameras for doing it that you can buy, which sometimes are relatively inexpensive, a couple of £100 up to thousands, depending on what you want. And they will show the colour up, but it's not what you see through the eyepiece.
And the night sky, it changes, doesn't it? Obviously, it moves very quickly.
All the
And I think people don't realize how fast it moves. So you set up your telescope, you go away for half an hour and it's changed. It can,
Yeah,
it,
that's right. I mean, I think one of the things that fascinated me when I first started it, I've always been interested in astronomy. My dad sort of got me into it when I was young. He took me out to see the Milky Way down in Cornwall. and it's something we really don't see anymore. You do see it if you go to a dark sky site, but they're getting very rare now. We're trying to make specific ones now, but so much light pollution around, you don't see it like you did when I was a little boy. That, and also I'm nearly 64 now, so your eyesight goes as well, so you don't see these things as well. You get things like cataracts and stuff like that. So I remember him taking me sort of along the cliff top at night. I just thought about that. That wasn't a great idea, was it? Cliff top at night, and to see the Milky Way. I think in Cornwall at that time, they used to, I think they still do in parts of it, turn the street lighting off at about 2 o'clock in the morning anyway. And just the sight of this ribbon of the Milky Way, if you've never seen it, try and go and see it while you can, because it's getting so much more light polluted. It's just like a milky ribbon right the way across the sky. And so that's what got me into it, really. And the sky changes all the time, mostly the planets. It's when I first sort of come back to astronomy, I used to really love it as a kid, got more and more into aeroplanes, and then space flight again when they were landing on the moon, because I was 9 when they landed on the moon, so a good age to appreciate it. And then sort of went back more to airplanes. So I didn't come back to astronomy till, sort of 20 odd years ago. I mean, it's always been there, but sort of serious astronomy, as it were. And so when I came back to it, one of the things that fascinated me really was what I call loosely the dance of the planets. The planets, obviously, we're all going around the sun, all of us, including the Earth, and we're always in different positions. And sometimes they're in the night sky, sometimes they're in the other sky, and you gradually learn where they're going to be. And that's nice to show people. A lot of people don't realise that how many planets you can see with the naked eye. They think they're all stars. In fact, we had our kitchen extended in January, and one of the guys I was talking to realised I was into astronomy, and he said, "Oh, you can't see anything like planets, can you?" And I said, "Well, there's that one there, that's Venus, and then if you look over there, you've got Jupiter," or whatever. And I was pointing them out to him, and he was like really fascinated, as though while he was up on top of there to do a bit of work on the sort of flat roof, and they were up there and they were pointing at them, and by the end of the week they knew where everything was. And that's quite nice to see. I mean, basically, you can certainly see Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, Venus, and Mercury. You can still see as well. That's a bit more of a tricky spot, but when you know where to look for it, it's there. The other planets further out, they need binoculars or a telescope to see those.
You mentioned looking at the Milky Way. What sort of things do you enjoy observing?
The planets, really, for me. The first time you see Saturn, particularly because of its rings, I was about 16 years old when I first saw it. The Astronomical Society, which I am now chairman of, used to be in what used to be called the Butts Technical College. I live in Coventry, and it's now a hotel, but it used to be there, and they had a great big telescope on the roof, and took me up and looked at Saturn for the first time, and you think, wow. And even though it may be small in a smaller home setup telescope, there's still something about that, and Jupiter as well, because Jupiter it's got lots of moons, but 4 big main moons, and they're constantly going around it, and you can see those every time you look, and sort of obviously see the red spots. So the planets, really. Probably those 2 planets in specific for me, but Mars is quite interesting. But Mars sort of comes and goes. It gets closer to us, so it's quite reasonably big, and then it goes away again, and it's small and hard to define and look at stuff on it. It's a bit of a tricky planet. Venus also, because it's covered in cloud, you don't really see much. You see the phases of it, like we have the moon. You know how you get a crescent moon, and that any planets that are inner to us, nearer to the sun, you will see crescent phases, like you would see the moon. In other words, from a full moon to a waxing or waning moon. You see the same with Mercury and Venus. Mars you don't, because it's further out. Anything further out will always have the sunlight on it from our point of view, so you'll see the full disk there.
And you don't need expensive equipment, do you, to observe the stars? You can use a pair of binoculars.
No, I mean, people can get started. I'd recommend, if people were trying to start, to actually just get a pair of binoculars, really, to be honest. You can see an awful lot with binoculars, particularly things like, say, the Orion Nebula in the constellation of Orion. You can see that very well with binoculars. As long as you can keep them steady and they're big enough power, you can see the moons of Jupiter, possibly even the rings of Saturn, although it'd be quite tiny. I mean, the first telescope I ever had that my dad bought me was only a 3-inch, what I'd call almost like a toy telescope now. You can still get those. They're relatively expensive. You just look in the end, and I could see the rings of Saturn with that. Excuse me, I just need a little drink. It's only water, folks. I'm not boozing.
I think a lot of the frustration with stargazing is the fact you buy these telescopes and they're essentially toy telescopes, and like you say, the expectation is you see this nebula or this fantastic picture taken by the Hubble Space Telescope or whatever, and you think, yeah, I'm going to get that instantly, and it just takes a bit of time, doesn't it? And you have to do a little bit of research as to what you're looking at that time of year in that position in the night sky.
Well, the main thing is actually looking through a telescope is tracking, really, because obviously our planet is spinning. So it's not the planets that are moving. Well, they are moving, but very slowly, if you know what I mean. They are moving, and they do appear in different parts of the sky at different parts of the year, of course. But that's partly because of our Earth going round as well. So from our viewpoint, looking at Mars or whatever, it's also going round at a different speed. But it's tracking with a telescope, because basically even the moon, you point a small telescope at that, if it's not tracking the night sky or taking into account rather the rotation of the Earth, then it's just going to drift straight out of the view, especially something like Saturn. You pointed at Saturn, oh, there's Saturn, I found it, oh, it's drifting out, and it's gone. And the other thing about that with something like a reflector telescope, the image is backwards and upside down. So if it drifts out to the left, you move the telescope left, you're going the wrong way. Or if you move it up, you're going the wrong way because it's actually going down, because you've got to remember that. So looking through a telescope for somebody who's just bought one, that doesn't affect the reflector ones where the refractor ones when you're just looking through the end, it'll be the right way up. But and you can more or less point it. But like I have a Dobsonian telescope, and that has a finder scope on the top, which is a little bit like a gun sight, with a cross on it, and you can look through that and point it at what you want to, and then if you look through the main scope, it'll be in it. But my telescope tracks the sky, so what you do is you align it to a couple of stars. First of all, you tell it the date, the time, where you are, which once it's entered once, it will usually remember that, like your mobile phone would. And then basically you just align to a couple of those, and then it has a computer database, and you say, I want to go and look at Mars or whatever, push the button, and it will slew to the thing, and then take into account the rotation of the Earth and keep it in view, or as near as, so you can just adjust it a little bit. But with smaller, cheaper telescopes, they don't do that. So people get frustrated because they're just pointing at it and it drifts out of view, and it's another thing they say, oh, I don't want to see that grey object again. And off we go. So it's like that, really.
Are those tracking telescopes, so do they have a motor inside them to kind of move it slightly?
Yes. Yeah.
Are they quite complicated to operate?
No, not really. Equatorial telescopes are more difficult. You have to align to the pole star for that, really, and that's a bit more tricky. Dobsonian telescopes, they're what are called alt-az telescopes, so they don't track in a smooth motion. They sort of go up and right a bit, like in steps, whereas an equatorial would be a smooth movement. Now that doesn't matter for normal viewing at all, but if you're doing astrophotography, it will, because it's not a smoother movement, and it doesn't keep the things in place, so you get little bits of star trails and things off that. So it's more difficult to do photography through it. It's perfectly possible, but most of the photography these days is done in hundreds of small photographs. You don't sort of point it there and do like a 10-minute exposure. You can on an equatorial, but you on a Dobsonian or something like that, you do it and do a sort of 10-second exposure, and then you get 200 10-second exposures. Then you stack them in software, and that sort of bumps up that time exposure, if you know what I mean, by doing that. And it also throws out any bad ones that you didn't like, fuzzy ones. So you can do photography through them, and I have done. But as I say, there's nothing more frustrating with any telescope than everything drifting out of view. And the smaller the telescope, the worse that is, because it's going to drift out very quickly.
One thing you notice in the night sky the amount of satellites. You kind of look up there and you don't realize how populated the kind of orbit of the Earth is with all these satellites and space junk. It was a kind of I didn't know that at all, to be honest. You're looking up there and you see these little dots moving so quick. It's quite fascinating to realize how cluttered Earth's orbit is.
If you stand out, and obviously first thing you need to do, if you're going to go and observe the night sky, firstly try and keep out of the sight of any lights. If you're going out in your back garden, and somebody next door's got a security light going on and off, it's going to ruin your night vision. You have to get what we call dark adapted. Our eyes will adjust to the dark, but it takes about 15 minutes. And you'll notice if you stood there in a dark place, looking at the night sky, you'll start to see more and more stars. And then you start to notice these, like you said, these little white dots that are going across the sky. One will go that way, one will go the other way, this, that, and the other. When I was a kid, my dad used to take me out because it was a little bit of a special thing to see a satellite then. I mean, I was born in 1960, so about the time the first satellites were coming up, so there was only a few of them. And you wouldn't see that many of them. So he said, there's a satellite coming up. Again, they'd know from charts in those days, not an app. You can get apps to do it now. But so he would know that there was one coming up and go and see it. And you'd see this go across the sky. Now, of course, the best one to see is the International Space Station. You can get apps to see that go off. It's not because it doesn't go over. Well, it goes over every night, but basically it has to be, all of these satellites to see them have to be high enough to be reflecting the sunlight. So the space station usually is, not all the time, but so that you can get some incredibly bright passes of that. It looks like Venus, if you've ever seen Venus, really, really bright in the night sky, or the brightest landing lights on a commercial jet you've ever seen, but it's steadily going across. And then you can see it go into the Earth's shadow sometimes as well. It just fades away as it goes into the Earth's shadow, as it goes into the night side. But it is becoming more and more of a problem to serious astronomy, because you've now got Elon Musk, although he's doing great things with SpaceX and possibly, moving on to Mars and all that kind of thing, big ambitions. But he's putting up thousands, and I mean thousands, of these Starlink satellites. He's not the only one. And what they're aiming to do is obviously bring internet to wherever on the planet you are. But that needs a constant constellation of satellites. So in other words, like a grid of satellites around the Earth. And when he puts them up, you can see them when they first launch. You can see them in a string, about 20, 30 satellites literally going across, like it looks like an express train going across the sky. They have said they're trying to paint them black so it doesn't reflect things, but it's not really working. And the problem is now there's a lot of ground-based telescopes, serious astronomers, not amateurs like myself, but the observatories and things that do it, like Jodrell Banks radio telescopes. So it doesn't matter for the photos, but even the Hubble Space Telescope, which is in orbit, has got satellites above that, and these trails are going across their photographs, and now having to work out software to remove these trails from the serious photographs because there's becoming so many of them. So they're hoping to put up thousands, something like 30 or 40,000 of these things, and they're halfway through that now. And then there's about 3 other companies hoping to put similar constellations up. So you're going to get a point in the not too distant future where you're not going to know whether it's stars or satellites. Just looking up at night sky, we're losing the night sky really one way or another, light pollution or these satellites. But of course, most people would say, well, I want my internet, I want my TV streamed down to me. I don't care about night sky. Really.
Yeah.
And a lot of those same people will say, well, I don't know why you're interested in space generally, space launches, all these kind of things. It does nothing for us until you start. I was on holiday last week in Turkey, and I was reading a Sky at Night magazine, and it had a thing in about exactly what the space industry does. I mean, your tractors that are doing your farming are guided by satellites. Drug runners are being busted by these things, and all it surprised me how much is now tied up to space. The olden days it'd be say, well, all it did was coat me saucepan with Teflon so it's non-stick. That was always the big one. But now it's everything we do, the television, the phones, everything that goes through a satellite somewhere, or is controlled by the space industry somewhere.
I think, like you said, the concern is that it does seem to be uncontrolled. The amount of stuff that's going up there, it's staying up there, some of it's staying up there, and it doesn't seem
Yeah,
to
well,
be. When it's the end of its life, what happens to it? It just comes space junk.
yeah. Well, they're having to look more to that now. I mean, obviously, starting with the 60s, they just started chucking everything up, and I mean, obviously, it's a big planet. And when you see one of these sort of illustrations of how much space junk there is, you'd think it was like every 5 millimeters as a satellite. In reality, the planet is very big, and there are thousands of satellites in orbit, but they're not that close together. And they track them so they know when they do get close together, and the worry is that each time, and there have been a couple of collisions, if they collide, they produce a lot more fragments, and those fragments can damage other satellites. And if you've seen the film Gravity, that's kind of the premise of the film, that they get this runaway effect where everything's smashing into each other because of that. And that is becoming a possibility that could happen. And they are getting worried about it. So what they're doing now is they're trying to come up with ways of either sending satellites up that sort of send out a net and then drag these defunct ones down. Because there's a lot of the stuff that's up there has finished. It's not being used. And now they're making sure that any satellites that go up there have some sort of thrusters or whatever that can bring it down at the end of its life. So we're not just leaving it up there. But there's still a hell of a lot of junk up there to get rid of. And of course, that becomes a problem for launching things as well. If you've got too much of this, you imagine now you've got all these 30,000 satellites for Starlink or whatever. You've got to find a way through all of those to launch your rocket without hitting something. So the more you put up there, the worse that problem becomes. And, you've got to look at the entire route of the rocket as it shoots up out of the atmosphere, into space to get above those satellites.
If somebody was interested in astronomy, so they've got some binoculars, they're getting interested, what would the next step be?
Well, if you're that interested in it, join your local astronomy club. I'm not trying to do a plug for our society here. I'm a member of the Coventry and Warwickshire Astronomical Society. We've been going for about 82 years now, I think. And to join that, I mean, they usually have speakers every month. We have a section where we have our Sky Notes section where one of our guys tells us what's going on in the night sky that month, and then we have a speaker on various subjects, some of them technical and some not, and usually these societies normally meet once a month, and you can go along to there. Very often they have telescopes. You might have to be in the society for a while, but telescopes that you can borrow, so you don't necessarily have to go and buy your own. Not everybody's got enough money to buy a telescope of any size, or the will to. My other tip as well is that if you're an amateur as well, there are several astronomy magazines, but one of the easiest ones to learn things from is the Sky at Night magazine. I still subscribe to that myself. It's from the Sky at Night program, which is still going. I think it's one of the longest, or if not the longest, program on the television so far. It's shoved away on BBC 4 now, but it's still going once a month. But they do a magazine every month, and they have a good guide in there to the night sky. Tells you what's going on. They have things that you can see with your naked eye, with binoculars or with telescopes, and family friendly things, so you can bore the rest of your family by dragging them into the garden.
John, I've got to go, run out of time, but I really appreciate it. It's been fantastic talking to you.
Pleasure.
And it's really, really interesting. Take care, John.
And you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.